Today we are beginning a new study on Bible prophecy. Now, there are different ways that we can approach the study of Bible prophecy, particular end-time prophecy. I want to share some of those ways with you. First of all, we have the thematic approach. How is that way that we study Bible prophecy? Well, if you look at the book Last Day Events, which was written by Ellen White, you'll notice that each chapter deals with a successive event in end-time Bible prophecy. So basically, what they do in the book is take from the writings of Ellen White different aspects of Bible prophecy, and then they put them in chronological order. You know, we can do the same thing with the Bible. We can take different texts from different places in the Bible and put them in chronological order, how the events will take place at the very end. Another way of studying Bible prophecy is comparing Genesis with the book of Revelation. You know, I did a series called Cracking the Genesis Code, and I showed there that the stories of Genesis are not only stories, they are also prophecies. For example, Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so also will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. He also said, as it was in the days of Lot, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 is developed throughout all of Scripture, culminating in Revelation chapter 12. And we also have the story of Cain and Abel. This story shows in miniature the great final conflict and the issues in the conflict, which are obedience to God and worship the way that God has commanded. Another way that we can study Bible prophecy is through the books of Daniel and Revelation. The problem is neither one of these books is in chronological order, which means that we must study these prophecies and look at where in the course of history each event fits. For example, Daniel chapter 2 is repeated in Daniel 7, and that is repeated in Daniel 8 and 9, and then you have the final development in Daniel chapter 10 through 12. So it's not like you start in Daniel 1 verse 1 and go through Daniel chapter 12 and verse 13, and you have all events in chronological order. The book of Revelation is even more complex, because you have foretastes and you have flashbacks. It goes back to history, then forward to end-time events. And so one of the key factors in studying the book of Revelation is decoding the literary structure of the book. So you don't have all of the end-time events in chronological order, beginning with Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, and ending in chapter 22. Another approach to Bible prophecy is through the parables of Jesus. You know, a couple of years ago, I did an Anchor School of Theology here in our studio, and we studied the end-time dimension of the parables of Jesus. As I prepared the manual or the study notes for that class, I was amazed at the number of parables of Jesus that have to do directly with end-time events. Let me just mention some of them. The 10 virgins. You have the closing of the door of probation in that story. The talents and the reckoning of the end when God looks at what we did with the talents that He gave us. We have the parable of the sheep and the goats, which is a portrayal of the final judgment. You have the man who sneaked into the wedding chamber without a garment. Obviously, that refers to the investigative judgment. So these are different approaches to Bible prophecy. You can take the thematic approach. You can take the book of Genesis and look at how it relates to the book of Revelation. You can study Bible prophecy from the perspective of Daniel and Revelation, although you have to take a look at the structure of each. And you can study end-time events from the perspective of the parables of Jesus. But there's one particular way that we're going to look at in this series that we're beginning today. And that is studying end-time Bible prophecy from the perspective of Matthew chapter 24. Now, Matthew chapter 24 is especially significant when we study Bible prophecy. And that is because the chapter is in strict chronological order. In other words, all of the major end-time events are presented in the way in which they will transpire, one event after the other, in strict chronological order. So in our class today, we are going to study 7 great truths about Matthew chapter 24. Point number 1. The study of Matthew chapter 24 is extremely important. I want to read a statement that we find in the book Gospel Workers, page 148. This statement deals with the importance of Matthew chapter 24. This is how it reads. The 24th chapter of Matthew is presented to me again and again as something that is to be brought to the attention of all. We are today living in the time when the predictions of this chapter are fulfilling. Let our ministers and teachers explain these prophecies to those whom they instruct. Let them leave out of their discourses matters of minor importance and present the truths that will decide the destiny of souls. So what are the main points that we find in this particular quotation? First of all, Ellen White saw time and again that Matthew 24 should be carefully studied. Then she also said that the events in Matthew 24 are in the process of being fulfilled. She counsels our ministers and teachers to explain these prophecies to those whom they instruct. And she also instructed the teachers and the ministers to set aside things of minor consequence and to preach on subjects that deal with the destiny of souls. And of course, she's dealing with Matthew 24. This chapter has something to do with the final destiny of souls. That's point number 1. The study and teaching of Matthew 24 is of vital importance, a matter of life and death. The second point that I want to share, the second great truth from Matthew chapter 24, is that this chapter was not written primarily for secular people, to show them that the signs of the times indicate that the coming of Jesus is very near. The purpose is not primarily to show unbelievers that the events in the political, economic, social, and religious world indicate that the end is near and that Jesus is about to come in the clouds of heaven. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with preaching evangelistic sermons using Matthew chapter 24. But the central purpose of the chapter is actually to keep God's own people from being deceived at the end of time. In other words, it is primarily a message for God's people, for those who profess to follow the Lord, rather than a message for the world at large. You say, how do we know that? Well, let's take a look at several verses in chapter 24 of Matthew that show that this is dealing with God's people specifically. I'll repeat once again, before we read these verses, that Jesus told his followers that Satan was going to try and deceive them, discourage them, persecute them, and kill them so that they would lose their faith. So the purpose of this chapter is to encourage God's own people to hang in there in the midst of trial and tribulation. Now notice the verses that indicate that this chapter has to do primarily with those who profess to follow and serve the Lord. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 4, this discourse is being given by Jesus to his own disciples. They are alone there on the Mount of Olives. And we're told in Matthew 24 and verse 4, and Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. He's speaking to his disciples. Make sure no one deceives you. Then the very next verse, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 5, says, for many will come in my name. So you'll notice that these must be Christians because they're coming in the name of Jesus. So for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. Jesus is saying, many are going to come in the name of Jesus, and they're going to deceive many. And he's saying to his disciples, make sure that you are not deceived. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 and 16, I'm only taking a sampling of texts from Matthew 24 that shows that this chapter is given particularly to those who profess to follow Jesus, to keep them from being deceived, to keep them hanging in there. Matthew 24, 15 and 16 speaks about the abomination of desolation. It says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. That's verse 17. So those in the city, when they saw a certain sign, they were to flee from the city. Now, unbelievers would not know what the sign was, but believers would know what the sign was. So once again, the sign is for those who believe in Jesus so that they don't stay in the city and they flee before the city is destroyed. Then you have Matthew 24, verses 23 to 25. Once again, Jesus is speaking to his disciples. We find in chapter 23, 4 and verse 23, then if anyone says to you, that is to the disciples, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So notice once again here, Jesus says, if anyone says to you, here is the Christ. Then he says that Satan's attempt is to deceive the very elect. And then Jesus finally says, I have told you, my followers, my disciples, beforehand. Now the question is, who are the elect? Well, the elect are those who have received Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. Notice Romans chapter 8, verses 33 and 34. Romans 8, 33 and 34. Here the Apostle Paul wrote, who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is he who condemns? It is Christ who died, and furthermore is also risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. So notice, the elect are those who have been justified and those for whom Jesus Christ intercedes. Now, I could show you in many other places in Matthew chapter 24, as well as Matthew chapter 25, that the focus of these chapters is upon God's people. God wants to tell his people through this sermon, don't be deceived. Don't give up when you're persecuted. Hang in there. Now, the third point that I want to share with you is that we must study all three gospel accounts in order to get the full picture of end-time events. You see, this sermon of Jesus in Matthew chapter 24 is found also in Mark 13 as well as in Luke chapter 21. Which means that if we want the total picture, we have to look not only at Matthew 24, but also Mark 13 as well as Luke chapter 21. And you say, well, why do we have to compare all three Gospels if it's the same sermon? The reason is because Luke presents details that Mark doesn't have. And Mark presents details that Matthew doesn't have. In other words, as you look at all three Gospels, you get a full and complete picture of what Jesus wanted to teach regarding end-time events. Let me give you some examples of the importance of taking all three Gospels together. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 7 reads like this, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. So this verse says that there are going to be earthquakes. Now, Luke 21 verse 11 has an additional detail. Here, Luke, recording the sermon that Jesus spoke, wrote the following, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences. And there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. So notice, Matthew says earthquakes, Luke says great earthquakes. It might appear to be an incidental detail, but it's important to get the full picture. Not only tremors, but great earthquakes. Notice Mark chapter 13, verse 8. It has a detail that Matthew doesn't have. It says there in Mark 13 and verse 8, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines, and, this is from the King James and the New King James, and troubles. That is not in the Gospel of Matthew or in the Gospel of Luke. There's going to be troubles. Now, what does that word mean? According to the lexicons, it means disturbances. In other words, social upheaval, such as we are seeing today. It is used, for example, in John chapter 5 and verses 4 and 7 for the troubling of the waters in the pool of Bethesda. In other words, in society, there was going to be disturbances. There were going to be riots and things such as we have been seeing in the world in the last few years. So Mark 13, verse 8 adds a detail which is very important in the study of Matthew chapter 24. Now, let's notice Matthew 24, verses 9 and 10. Matthew 24, 9 and 10. This verse says, then they will deliver you, once again, the followers of Jesus, up to tribulation and kill you. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. So those who are being persecuted, they're Christians because they have the name of Jesus. And then verse 10 says, and then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. So these two verses in Matthew 24, 9 and 10 speaks about tribulation. People are going to rise to kill the faithful. The faithful will be hated by all nations for Christ's name's sake. And then it says that many will be offended at that time and will betray one another and hate one another. Now, it doesn't say who is going to hate who in Matthew chapter 24, verses 9 and 10. This is why it is helpful for us to take a look at the parallel passage in Mark 13, verses 11 to 13. Luke gives us much more details, as does Mark. So let's notice just the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13 and verses 11 to 13. But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak. But whatever is given to you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. So notice that God's people, when they are delivered, when they're arrested, they are going to be taken before political leaders, before kings and rulers. And they're going to have to speak what they believe. They're going to have to give testimony. And we're told, don't worry about what you're going to say, because the Holy Spirit is going to enlighten your mind and tell you what to say. And then notice verse 12 tells us who is going to hate who. Matthew chapter 24 simply said, many will be offended, betray one another, and will hate one another. Oh, but Mark adds some very interesting details. Verse 12 of chapter 13 of Mark says, now brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. And children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. Wow, this adds a lot of details. God's people are not only going to be hated by outsiders. It says here, brother will betray brother to death. Father his child, children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. So the Gospel of Mark tells us who is going to hate who. Matthew simply tells us that some will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. Let me give you one more example from Matthew chapter 24, where it's important to compare the other two Gospels. Notice Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15. This is referring to the abomination of desolation. It says there, Jesus is speaking, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place," so notice, the abomination of desolation is standing in the holy place, "whoever reads, let him understand." Now, Mark phrases it a little different. Very similar, but just a detail which is different. Mark 13, verse 14 says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet," and instead of saying standing in the holy place, it says standing where it ought not. So Matthew says standing in the holy place, and Mark says standing where it ought not. Let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now Luke presents what Jesus said in a totally different light. It says in Luke chapter 21 and verse 20, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near." So the abomination of desolation is when armies surrounded the city of Jerusalem. Amazing. So when you compare all three Gospels, you find that the abomination of desolation stands in the holy place where it should not, and the abomination of desolation is when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. Now we need to notice in Luke chapter 21, verse 20, several details. First of all, the holy place is an area outside the city walls. You say, how do we know that? Well, because it says when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So the abomination of desolation is outside the city walls. Secondly, we notice that the abomination of desolation is the siege of Jerusalem, not the destruction of Jerusalem. That desolation is the destruction. The abomination is something that can be seen before the destruction. Now, let's notice point number 4 in our initial study on Matthew chapter 24. Point number 4 is that Matthew 24 has a twofold fulfillment. In other words, it has a dual fulfillment. One in the destruction of Jerusalem, and the other in events that will take place at the very end of time. You say, how do we know this? Well, we need to go to Matthew chapter 24 and verses 1 to 3. Let's begin at verse 1. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. So Jesus, for the last time, departs the temple. And his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. Undoubtedly very impressive. Some of those stones weighed 50 to 60 tons. They were huge. And so the disciples want to impress Jesus. They show him the buildings of the temple, as if Jesus had never seen the buildings of the temple. Verse 2, and Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." And now the disciples are really surprised. They're saying, not one stone of this massive temple is going to remain upon the other? What did Jesus mean? So now they're going to ask Jesus 2 questions. This is important, 2 questions. Let's go to verse 3. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be?" What were they referring to when they said, "When will these things be?" They were referring to the destruction of the temple. But now they ask another question. And the second question is also found in verse 3. "And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age or the end of the world. So they're saying, what is the sign of the destruction of the temple, and what will be the sign of the end of the age and your coming? Now, the disciples understood that both of these events would happen at the same time. Jesus understood that they would not happen at the same time. So what Jesus did was he actually used the destruction of Jerusalem as a symbol, a type, or an illustration of a greater destruction to take place at the end of time. Now, I want to read several statements, and there are many of them, and I want to read them to make a very important point. You see, we've already noticed in Matthew chapter 24, 1-3, there are two questions, two events: destruction of Jerusalem, end of the age or end of the world. Jesus is going to take the destruction of Jerusalem as a type or a small-scale model of the events that will lead up to the destruction of the world. Ellen White makes this clear repeatedly in her writings. I want to read several of these. Last Day Events, page 18. Christ forewarned his disciples of the destruction of Jerusalem and the signs to take place prior to the coming of the Son of Man. And then she states this very important detail. The whole of the 24th chapter of Matthew is a prophecy concerning the events to precede this event. What event? Well, she just said, the signs to take place prior to the coming of the Son of Man. So she says the whole chapter of Matthew 24 is a prophecy concerning the events to precede this event. And the destruction of Jerusalem is used to typify the last great destruction of the world by fire. So she's saying that the destruction of Jerusalem is a type of a greater destruction at the end of time. The events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem are types of the events that will lead up to the destruction of the world. Great Controversy, page 25. The prophecy which he uttered was twofold in its meaning. While foreshadowing the destruction of Jerusalem, it prefigured also the terrors of the last great day. So notice, it had a twofold meaning. The destruction of Jerusalem prefigured the terrors of the last great day. Desire of Ages, page 743. From the fall of Jerusalem, the thoughts of Jesus passed to a wider judgment. In the destruction of the impenitent city, he saw a symbol of the final destruction to come upon the world. So notice she says that the destruction of Jerusalem typifies the destruction of the world. The prophecy has a twofold meaning. The destruction of Jerusalem prefigured the terrors of the last great day. Chapter 24 points to a wider judgment. He saw in the destruction of Jerusalem a symbol of the final destruction. Here's another one, Desire of Ages, page 628. Jesus did not answer his disciples by taking up separately the destruction of Jerusalem and the great day of his coming. In other words, Jesus didn't say, these are the signs that lead up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and these are the signs that lead up to the destruction of the world. No. She continues, he mingled the description of these two events. Had he opened future events to his disciples as he beheld them, they would have been unable to endure the sight. In mercy to them, he blended. Notice, she used the word mingled. Now she says, in mercy to them, he blended the description of the two great crises, leaving the disciples to study out the meaning for themselves. When he referred to the destruction of Jerusalem, his prophetic words reached beyond that event to the final conflagration in that day when the Lord shall rise out of his place to punish the world for their iniquity, when the earth shall disclose her blood and shall no more cover her slain. And then comes this statement. The entire discourse, not part, the entire discourse was given, not for the disciples only, but for those who should live in the last scenes of this earth's history. Here's another one, Great Controversy, page 22. Christ saw in Jerusalem a symbol of the world hardened in unbelief and rebellion, and hastening on to meet the retributive judgments of God. In Great Controversy, page 22, she wrote, Jesus, looking down to the last generation, saw, listen carefully now, saw the world involved in a deception similar to that which caused the destruction of Jerusalem. In other words, the sin of the world at the end is similar to the sin that was committed by the Jewish nation. You say, what is the similarity? She continues, the great sin of the Jews was their rejection of Christ. The great sin of the Christian world would be their rejection of the law of God, the foundation of His government in heaven and earth. You say, well, those are two different sins. Rejecting Christ and rejecting His law are two different sins. No, they're not. You see, the law is a reflection of Christ's character. So how can you say, I reject the reflection of Christ's character, and not say that you're rejecting Christ at the same time? The law is a written demonstration of what the character of Christ is alike. So how can you say, I love Jesus, but the law was nailed to the cross? It just doesn't make sense. It's basically the same idea to reject Jesus in person as it is to reject the reflection of His character in His holy law. Great Controversy, page 36. The Savior's prophecy concerning the visitation of judgments upon Jerusalem is to have another fulfillment, of which that terrible desolation was but a faint shadow. Now, if you want to see how terrible Jerusalem was, just read Josephus's works, Wars of the Jews, or read the first chapter of the book Great Controversy. You say, how can anything be worse than what Ellen White describes in that chapter on the destruction of Jerusalem? And yet Ellen White is saying here that what happened in Jerusalem was but a faint shadow of what's going to happen at the end of time. She continues, in the fate of the chosen city, we may behold the doom of a world that has rejected God's mercy and trampled upon His law. A couple of more statements. This one is Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, pages 120 and 121. The ruin of Jerusalem was a symbol of the final ruin that shall overwhelm the world. The prophecies that received a partial fulfillment in the overthrow of Jerusalem have a more direct application to the last days. We are now standing on the threshold of great and solemn events. A crisis is before us, such as the world has never witnessed. And then I'll give you one final one on this point, Testimonies to Ministers, page 232. The warnings that Christ gave to Jerusalem were not to end with them. The judgments upon Jerusalem were a symbol of the events of Christ's coming to judgment in the last day, when before Him shall be gathered all nations. He shall send His angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together His elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So clearly, the destruction of Jerusalem and the events that led up to this particular event symbolizes what is going to happen at the very end of time. I review what Ellen White states. She says the whole chapter has to do with the second coming of Christ. The destruction of Jerusalem typifies what is going to take place. The prophecy has a twofold meaning. The destruction of Jerusalem prefigured the terrors of the last day. The destruction of Jerusalem pointed to a wider judgment. The destruction of Jerusalem was a symbol of the destruction of the world. He mingled, he blended the destruction of Jerusalem with what's going to happen at the end of time. The entire discourse has to do with end time events, and so on. So clearly, Matthew chapter 24 has a dual fulfillment. In other words, it pointed to the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 and to the events that led up to that particular event. And it also on a larger scale, points to the final destruction of the world. Now, point number 5 in our study, and let's just review the points that we've studied so far. First of all, the prophecy of Matthew 24 is of vital importance. We must study it and we must teach it. Secondly, it's a message for God's own professed people. The primary purpose is not for the world in general, not for the secular, although we can use it to show that the signs indicate that Jesus is coming soon. The purpose of the chapter is to get God's people to hang in there and to not be deceived, not to give up. Point number 3, we must study all 3 Gospels together: Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke chapter 21. Point number 4, Matthew 24 has a twofold fulfillment. Now let's go to point number 5, and this one is particularly important. The events of Matthew 24 are in strict chronological order. So if you want to know what the order of end-time events is going to be, you have them in Matthew chapter 24. It's different than the parables of Jesus, that each parable deals with a different aspect of end-time events. It's different than studying Genesis and Revelation because the Genesis stories touch different elements of end-time events. So you have to put all of the stories in the chronological order in which the events will occur. So the unique way of studying Matthew chapter 24 is the fact that the chapter is in chronological order. And you say, well, Pastor Bohr, how do you know that Matthew chapter 24 is in chronological order? Well, because of several temporal expressions that are used in the chapter. Let's notice several of these. In fact, let's look at all of the temporal expressions in this chapter. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 6. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Then notice verse 7. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. Now comes the temporal expression. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then we have a very important little word that is used throughout the chapter. In fact, it's used 9 times in Matthew chapter 24. Mark and Luke only use the word 4 times. But in Matthew chapter 24, you have this little word used 9 times. It is a temporal expression. What is it? It's the word then. It translates the Greek word tote. What does tote mean? I'm going to read from the Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament. This is the definition. Tote means in the sense of thereafter. Introduces that which follows temporally. In other words, this happens, then this, and then this. In other words, events that occur in chronological order. Let's notice verse 9. This word is used. After saying that the wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places, and saying that this is the beginning of sorrows, verse 9 begins by saying, then. In other words, there's a relationship between all these disasters in society and what happens in verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then in verse 10, you have the word again. And then, that is when people are delivered by their enemies to death, it says, then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. In other words, many are going to forsake the faith as a result of persecution. Then we notice in verse 11, then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. In fact, we're going to notice in our study that many of those who forsook the message when persecution came, they then became false prophets to accuse God's faithful people before tribunals, before political leaders. And then I want you to notice, we're noticing where the word then is used, verse 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So you notice you have the preaching of the gospel, then you have the end. Notice also verse 19. The word then is not used, but you have a temporal expression. Actually, let's go to verse 15. It says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. So when you see the abomination of desolation, it says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So notice once again, the word then. The flight comes when the sign is seen. Once again, chronological order. Then we go to verse 19. It says, but woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, that is, in the days of the great tribulation when God's people fled. And then verse 21 uses the word then again. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. So notice, you have the sign, God's people flee, and then you have not only the tribulation, which was mentioned in verse 9, but the great tribulation. And then I want you to notice verse 21 again. Then there will be great tribulation, such has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And then in the midst of the tribulation, after the tribulation begins, after God's people have fled, it says in verse 23, it says, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. You know, Ellen White describes this as the counterfeit second coming of Jesus Christ. Satan is going to counterfeit the second coming of Jesus. It's spoken of in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So notice, you have the abomination of desolation, which is the sign. God's people flee. Then there is a great tribulation. And in the midst of the tribulation, then Satan is going to counterfeit the second coming of Christ. That's verses 23 through verse 27. And then interestingly, in verse 28, it says, for wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. We'll deal with that a little bit later. Notice verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. Notice again, this is taking place as a chain of events in chronological order. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Verse 30 uses once again the same word. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Then it says in verse 31, and he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Clearly, Matthew 24 presents end-time events in chronological order. So let's go now to point number 6. Particularly important, this point. If you want the best commentary that has ever been written on Matthew chapter 24, you need to read the book, The Great Controversy by Ellen White. You see, Matthew chapter 24 begins with the destruction of Jerusalem, and it ends with the coming of Christ. If you read the book Great Controversy, you'll find that the first chapter of Great Controversy is the destruction of Jerusalem. And the closing event is the second coming of Christ and the millennium. But the Great Controversy fills in many gaps with details between the great events that are mentioned in Matthew chapter 24. The book Great Controversy is also in chronological order. In other words, it begins with the destruction of Jerusalem, then it moves throughout the course of church history, and it comes to end-time events, the deceptions of Satan, and the second coming of Jesus, and the taking of his people to heaven, and then after that, the millennium. So if you want to fill in the gaps of the great prophetic events, the sequence of prophetic events that we find in Matthew chapter 24, you need to read the book, The Great Controversy, because that is a commentary on Matthew chapter 24. By the way, if you want to get a copy of Great Controversy when you watch this presentation, I would encourage you to get in touch with Secrets Unsealed. We have plenty of great controversies on hand, and you can get a copy from us. The final point, point number 7, is that when Matthew 24 uses the word you, it's not referring only to the original recipients of the sermon of Jesus. You see, the you there applies to God's people at all times in history till the very end of time. You notice that in Matthew chapter 24, the word you is used very frequently. Let's notice. Verse 4, take heed that no one deceives you. Then you have verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Then you have in verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation. Then you have verse 15, therefore when you see the abomination of desolation. Then you have verse 20, it says, and pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Verse 23, then if anyone says to you, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. Verse 25, see, I have told you beforehand. Verse 26, therefore if they say to you, look, he is in the desert. Then you have verse 33. It says, so you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verse 42, watch therefore, for you do not know what hour the Lord is coming. And verse 44, therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So who does the you refer to here? Does it refer only to the disciples and the events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem? Or does it apply to all Christians at all times? Folks, it applies to all Christians at all times. The fact that Jesus spoke it directly to his disciples doesn't mean that it does not apply to all of God's people at the end of time. Let me give you some examples of where Jesus used the word you, and Christians have no problem in saying that the you applies to all Christians of all time. Matthew chapter 28 and verses 18 through 20 has what is known as the baptismal formula. There Jesus said, once again, verse 18, Matthew 28, and Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, who is he speaking to? To the disciples, right? All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Amen. Did Jesus give the Great Commission only to his 12 disciples? Well, it says he spoke to them, and he says, I have commanded you. So it must apply only to the disciples. Of course not. It applies to all Christians at all times. Notice John chapter 14, verses 1 to 3. Jesus, in the previous chapter, has just told his disciples that he's going to leave. And Peter says, well, I want to go with you. Jesus says, well, Peter, you can't go with me now, but you will follow me later. And Peter says, I don't want to follow you later. I want to go with you now. And so the disciples are very troubled by the idea that Jesus is going to leave them, because they had spent 3.5 years with him. They loved him. They couldn't conceive of even a minute living without being in the presence of Christ. So Jesus knew that they were troubled. So we find this famous passage in John 14, verses 1 to 3. Let not, he's speaking to the disciples, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. So only the disciples are going to be in the kingdom, right? Of course not. We take this promise as applying to all Christians of all ages. Jesus promises to take all of His people to heaven, not only those whom He addressed at first. Let me give you another couple of examples. John 16, verses 1 and 2. Jesus says to His disciples, "These things I have spoken to you, that you should not be made to stumble. They will put you out of the synagogues. Yes, the time is coming that whoever kills you will think that he offers God service." So here's my question. Is this saying that only the faithful believers who existed in the times of Christ would be put out of the synagogues? Or does this passage also tell us that at the end, faithful believers will be cast out of churches? Because we don't gather today in synagogues, we gather in churches. Obviously, these verses that describe persecution apply to all Christians of all ages. You know, Jesus raised up a prayer to His Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's actually on the way to the Garden of Gethsemane. And this prayer is found in John chapter 17. It's His great intercessory prayer for His disciples. He's saying, "I want them to be one. Father, as you and I are one." But He not only prayed these words for His disciples, because John chapter 17, verses 20 and 21 tells us that Jesus prayed this prayer for all who would believe as a result of the testimony of His disciples. It says in John 17, verses 20 and 21, "I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me." So notice that Christ's intercessory prayer applies not only to the original recipients, to the disciples, but also to all believers of all ages. So these are the 7 introductory points to the study of Matthew chapter 24. We have many other things that we're going to take a look at. I mean, it's amazing as you look at the sequence of events in this chapter. It points out in detail the great events that will take place one after another at the end of time. We're going to take a look at how it applied to events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and then we're going to take up the study of how these events foreshadowed or typified greater global events at the end of time. So let's review the 7 points that we have studied today. Number 1, the study of Matthew 24 is of vital importance. Ellen White was shown this again and again. The signs of Matthew 24 are fulfilling according to her. Ministers and teachers should instruct people using Matthew chapter 24. And preachers should leave off things of minor consequence and preach on things that will determine the destiny of souls, in this case, Matthew 24. Secondly, Matthew 24 is directed at those who claim to believe in Jesus Christ. The focus is not on the secular, on the world, although we can use this chapter in evangelism to show the world that the signs indicate that the coming of Jesus is near. But the main focus is that God's people hang in there, they stay faithful, and they are not deceived by Satan at the end of time. Then our third point is that we must take a look at all 3 accounts. We must look at Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21, because Mark and Luke add details that we don't find in Matthew chapter 24. Then we noticed that Matthew chapter 24 has a dual fulfillment. In other words, it was fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem and the events that led up to that, and it will have a greater global fulfillment in the events that lead up to the final destruction of the world. We also noticed, and this is point number 5, that the events of Matthew chapter 24 are in strict chronological order. One event follows the previous event, then there's another event after that one, and another event after that one, beginning with the destruction of Jerusalem and ending with the destruction of the world, the second coming of Jesus, and the gathering together of His elect. That's why it's wonderful to study this chapter, because everything is in chronological order. It's different than studying prophecy from other perspectives, where you have to kind of take and collate the different events in different passages and then put them in chronological order. Point number 6 is that the best commentary on Matthew 24 is in the book, The Great Controversy, written by Ellen White. By the way, that book has almost 700 pages. And it's commenting on one particular chapter. Of course, it has many other Bible verses corroborating the points, but the chronology of Great Controversy is the same sequence of the main events that we find in Matthew chapter 24. So if you want to get the full picture of all of the events that occur between the great events that are in chronological order, you need to get a copy of the book Great Controversy, have Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 on one side, have Great Controversy on the other side, and see where the book Great Controversy fills in the gaps between the great events that are described in Matthew chapter 24. The final point is that when Matthew 24 uses the word you, it is not referring only to the original disciples, to the 12, it's referring to all Christians. In other words, all Christians are in danger of giving up when persecution comes. All Christians are in danger of being deceived by Satan. All believers are tempted to throw in the towel and to give up. But the purpose of the chapter is that God's people should remain faithful, watchful. They should pray, and they should work, knowing that the coming of Jesus is near. Thank you for being with us. I look forward to a fuller study of this chapter.